All right, sweet. David, Michelle, so glad to be here again and we get to talk about dance. I'm pumped. I'm even more excited that we have somebody who I've kind of seen around the scene for many, many years. And I've been calling his name wrong this entire time. And I'm very excited for him to pronounce the correct way to call his name. But everyone calls him Forrest Outman. It's a pleasure to have you, sir. Will you do me a favor? Will you tell us how you pronounce your name correctly?
All right, so Forr is two R's, like in Forrest Gump, but it's old French actually, antiquated French. So it'd be Forrest, like Forrest, but no T. And then the last name is German, so it's Outman, not Outman, because that's English. But no one says it that way. Only somebody that would be German and French would say that.
I love it. Already we're learning stuff, man. This is amazing. So you have a vast knowledge of many things, and today we're going after some dance stuff. So maybe we can pick up with Waltz. I hear you know lots of interesting things about Waltz.
Sure. Waltz is really the beginning of what we know today as ballroom dancing. So starting really in the 1800s, you have the first book really written on the waltz in 1816, and the dance that we do today as far as the speed and such of the dance has changed quite a bit. So the waltz as they knew it isn't the same as the waltz as we know it. The tempos were, well, what we'd call a Viennese waltz,
right?
Since it was created there. Yes, waltz literally means to revolve, so it was the spinning dance, if you will. The significance of the waltz really is it's the first peasant dance, if you will, that was a lead-follow based dance. Before that, court dances were based upon what would be thought of as country dancing, yes? Contra dancing, country dancing, which comes from England and such. They did what is known as set or sequence dancing. I mean, it was a repeating sequence. A lot of folk dances, right, are based upon small choreographies, essentially, right, of movements that are repeated, like a mixer would be. So right. Think of it as a round mixer or square dancing. What we think of square dancing today would be like the equivalent of a lot of the quadrilles, lancers, minuets, things like that. Those were all types of sequence dancing that was sets, memorized essentially, and called. So you had either lines or squares or rounds, it would be known as, right? Basically the shape you assumed in the figure. But this dance was unique because it was individual. It wasn't a whole group that had a set sequence. You just grabbed a partner and went. So that was revolutionary. Yeah. And that was the idea of lead follow. Like no one person was controlling what was going on. Of course, it was really simple then. It was basically the reverse turn or right turn.
Right.
There was a difference too, though, because of the speed of the dance. It was considered a dance for the young. It wasn't the way we think of it today as stately.
Right.
It was the wild dance of its day. So it was a youth dance.
Okay.
And they had hopping and jumping variations and things, lifts for their partners. Again, stuff we wouldn't necessarily associate today with the waltz as we see it today, which is an interesting delineation between our minds, what we filter through when I say waltz, and the reality of what was. So that's one fun little thing to understand about history. Just because you know the words doesn't mean it means the same thing now, because it's about evolution.
Yeah.
So this is all in reference to what would have originated, which would be a Viennese waltz, right? A faster tempo based on
Right. Exactly. Faster tempo comparative to today.
Yeah.
Again, simplicity as well lends itself to that. You don't need to spend as much time on it. If you're young and able, they could just bumble through it. They didn't need to have great skill.
Yeah.
That as things mature in evolution, complexity naturally happens because people stay with it and they get better and they start creating.
So what about the transition, if I can just ask about that history lesson, Forrest, when we talk about Viennese and then the transition and evolution into slow waltz?
Okay, so that's an interesting thing. So during the evolution of waltz, you have experimentation happening through the 1800s, essentially. And then you start to see changes in tempo. You also start to see, again, because bands are going to be bands, they're going to start to add creative license to it and such. But you're also, more importantly, I think, in this instance, at least, going to find the dancers really changing things up. And a lot of people don't realize this, but America had a lot to do with the evolution of the waltz. Really, when we start getting into mixing things up more so. Before that, really, you had change steps, reverse turns, and natural turns. So basically spinning left, spinning right, and then going back and forth between that. Yeah. Then you had hop variations, some kick variations, things like that. Anything beyond that would be beyond the scope of what your average Joe would be doing. It's just not common because that would require some dance training. Not to say that there weren't people that did that. Those that were affluent had dance masters. So that would be the affluent people. They may have had more advanced training because they had dance masters, because they didn't have to do anything. But when we start getting into America, especially after the Civil War, you have something happening after the Industrial Revolution, and that's basically the average person was making more money now due to automation and such. The beginning of the revolution in science, especially into the turn of the century and the ragtime era. So that started allowing more people to go out dancing. They had more money, so they had more time, and they had the finances to do it. So we start getting, I'd say 1870 or so would be one of the big innovations, would be called the Boston. Okay, a dance known as the Boston, which is really a waltz variant. But it's really using more stationary movements. They did they call long or short Boston, but this is using what we would think almost today as hesitation steps. Okay. The technique for it would be like doing a turn almost in spot using a pivot turn technique. So you do a step and then turn with a ball change, and then a step and turn ball change. It's an interesting thing because it works really well when you're dancing at a higher tempo, because that's what they were doing. But Americans started to make it more streamlined as well, and not spinning all the time. Okay. That's definitely a thing that started to happen, as you see more streamlined and not spinning variations coming out of it, and these delayed timings. Like the hesitation waltz is an American dance in origin, as far as I think it's 1914. The canter, which is dancing 2 steps instead of 3, right? In timing. You've got 5-step waltz, things like that, where you syncopated waltz, right? So they're starting to innovate and switch timings now. So they're taking 1 step, and then next time they're taking 2 or 3 steps. So they're switching all over the place. And that's really where what we think of as waltz today comes from, is these many years of evolution. The real beginning of that, in my opinion, though, would be the ragtime era. That was just when social dancing exploded in America, and became something that everybody was doing instead of just the elite.
So let me ask this then. The original waltz then, as we would know it, would be a little closer to maybe quick step style or whatever. It was excited, it was energetic. It maybe wasn't as jumpy as the quick step is, but it wasn't as smooth as we've made it today. Oh no, I'd say it would definitely be more like a quick step, as far as even quick step is smooth by comparison, I would say. Right. Oh, really? Yeah, it'd be, if a better way to look at this would be to watch something more like cross-step waltz dancers, if you're familiar with them, because that's more of it. These aren't formal trained dancers as much, and it's young dancers dancing to fast music. That was really fun for me to go spend time with Richard Powers, another historian out in Stanford, because seeing his students that are college kids dancing fast waltz after fast waltz,
I was like, oh, this is really interesting, because this is a little bit more like what you would see if you just went out social dancing. You'd see people of varying skill levels that didn't have technical breakdowns and such, who were just going out and having fun. And, you know, they didn't have perfect frame and such.
Yeah.
You know, that even the way we perceive what perfect frame is today is completely different than they would have then.
Yep.
So because he also teaches dance history, their perception of right is different than the competitive ballroom world of today.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an interesting parallel. If I had to look for something that's a contemporary today, I'd look more in either the vintage dance community. That's going to be much more accurate. But if you want more the sense of the vigor and recklessness of youth, I would definitely look towards the cross-step waltz, because it's really a younger movement, and that's really interesting.
Wow, I'm super excited to check this out. I knew nothing about the cross-step waltz. This is blowing my mind.
It's cool. They do different stuff. It's neat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was definitely analyzing people on the floor and starting to play with stuff as soon as I got home.
So so what was
books and playing with them?
What did that look like? I mean, with all these young kids, all these energetic kids doing completely, I'll speak for myself, completely opposite of what I would think would be the waltz. They're just energetic. They're dancing tempo after tempo. Like what was that like?
If you think about this, it wouldn't be so clean. It would be, say, under rotations, but then they would just keep going into the next step. So one of the fun things that I learned over the years was that you don't have to, say, do a Viennese waltz and necessarily finish a rotation, a 360 in that 2 measures. You can make it a 4-measure rotation.
So
watching film, I saw people doing this, and at first I was like, what? And then I found books that actually had this, and I was like, oh, you can just take more time. It's possible. And especially in crowds and things, you can't just spin like a whirling dervish necessarily. You're a slave to the crowd. Right. So you have to remember, dance halls weren't, they were either big to-dos with thousands of people at them, or they could have been very small and untrained dancers. So it's not going to be perfect. People are going to be colliding and such. So
well, that's the reality of most dancing on a social level. I mean, aside from the small arena of competition, which is its own mix, social dancing and waltz, all of those things come into play all the time. You have to under-rotate, over-rotate, modify, change, work on the fly, move the floor, watch out for all of those things, which sounds really intriguing to check out this as part of the history of waltz, because it's practical, it's relevant. And it's probably quite intriguing.
Yeah, I think that is one of the things that I really enjoy about history, especially too going back and looking at stuff from the ragtime era and later, because now they had to deal with laymen. They had to deal with the masses instead of the elite. Those are some growing pains right there. There's arguments among the dance masters for some time, because you had the older guard still alive and pushing towards that. You know, where they were used to being full-time working with people like the Astors and such, you know, oil barons and such. And obviously they want to do that, good money. But you have the other people that now want to be the voice of change and go with the times. So you see those arguments happening back then, but you also see the changing, if you will, of the guard and the changing of mentality of the evolution of dance to being, like you said, more practical. These streamlined or progressive, using running steps and such in a waltz. Super common, really simple. What's easier to do? Just walk to every beat like a 1-step, or to have to do change steps? It's pretty obvious.
It always sounds quite simple when you put it that way. Well, should I complicate things with change steps, or should I just walk? And where do you have to get there?
Are harder to do than walking is. You already walk. All you got to do is teach people to your beat. Boom, boom, boom. Just walk. Well, boom, boom, boom. I feel like the waltz is so hard. I'm like, it's hard because you make it hard.
Right.
But it's literally walking to a beat. There's 3 beats. You take 3 steps.
Yeah, I know. It's pretty simple that way. And it's funny because some of the organized syllabuses, you know, if you look at some of the structured franchises, you know, a running step in waltz is very late in the game, and yet it has such a great level of practicality and use on the dance floor. And in a franchise version, excuse me, you're looking at it like way at the very end of a bronze program before you get to silver. And it's like, wait a minute, let's bring that in a lot earlier because we can use it and it has function, which ties into the evolution of what we've been discussing.
I definitely see that the change over the years in the focus, if you will, to instruction being more about having, you know, the same students essentially, right? You're building them up, right? Rather than it being large group classes, right? And then having privates as well. But when it started, you had large group classes as well. And the large group classes, it's going to be simpler, right? You just can't get technical stuff going in a class like that. And they need more practical stuff. So if you're teaching a bunch of kids, they used to have dancing in schools, dance teachers in schools, from grade school on in America. And you're teaching a bunch of kids, it's got to be simple. And when you look at the books, it's simple. It's great. I really like it. I'm going to grab one of my favorite books. Hold on.
Yeah. This is amazing. I wonder, while he's doing that, my brain is wondering everything on this, right? Like you've got your rise and fall with Waltz, which is a character of Waltz. Was that an issue back then, or did they not even care about it? So while you sat down and you've got your book, so the rise and fall is very characteristic of Waltz. Is that a modern, evolution of the waltz? Did they care about that back then when they were flying around and just turning?
It was more practical then. It was more practical. It wasn't, they certainly didn't talk about swing and sway.
Okay.
That's modern. Okay, so that was never addressed really. It was just standing up and moving. So the concept of shaping and all of that, that's all modern.
Yeah.
Really, you had rise and fall, but those were more to do with weight changes than anything. So they dance also earlier. They didn't really dance with heel leads. That's modern by comparison. You know, we're talking about 200 years, but heel leads really are something more from the late 20s.
Really?
Yeah. So before that, nobody talked about heel leads, and in Europe or America,
they just said go. They just said go. And
that was a new thing really in the late 20s. So if you look at manuals before then, they didn't do that. And then you start getting into heel leads really in England. It's an English thing. They called it the natural walk. Some people in America adopted it as well. Again, because it's just walking, the concept there. So it's the fusion of walking in conjunction with the older technique, and you get a hybridized form that then they standardized in England, because the culture, as far as culture goes, English culture had been doing sequence and set dancing for hundreds of years. So it was embedded in their culture, this idea of having a sequence. And this is why, even if you look in the instruction, they teach them a wall, right? So you learn an entire wall in maybe using 3 steps to begin with as your first, if you will, sequence that you learn.
Yeah.
Right? And then from that, then they add a few more steps into it, and that's the next sequence you learn. So it's kind of like when I watch somebody first doing a quick step, I can almost tell you what they're going to do before they do it.
Right.
Because it's almost a set sequence the way it has been since its invention.
Right.
That's interesting. So, Forrest, I'm wondering, you were describing how waltz really was one of the first, or the first, partner dance of the people. And given most dancing was done in the court before then, how shocking or controversial was the waltz in its early days? Or was it at all?
It's a great question. It was until people did it in the court. See, anybody that was doing, say, a peasant's dance, why would you do that if you were noble or forwardly mobile in society, right? Because back then class was very clear. So, you didn't want to necessarily associate with that, right? If you did, you did it on the down low, you didn't talk about it. Now, what happened is people like Louis XIV and such, he was a real innovator because he was super progressive and he loved to dance. Now, this is well after his time, but that spirit, if you will, in the French people lived on, right? Because it became part of their culture. And this progressive notion, if you will. So they were much more apt to adopt it into their court.
Yeah.
And then once they did, then it was okay for everyone to do. So now they didn't have to be on the down low about it. They could put it on their dance card.
Back to the dance card.
Yeah, they're not new.
No.
They go all the way back to the 1700s. You'll see them.
So you said you went and grabbed a book. What book did you grab?
Ooh, this is a goodie. Okay. Instruction in Social Dance by Edith Ballweber. I don't know if you can see that. There you go. This is really fun because it's a group instruction book. It's teaching teachers how to teach groups. This is, I think, 1938. But I'll show you kind of the fun part for me is if I were to just take a page here, and I'll see if you can see that or not.
Yes.
It shows right there, it's going to be the same exact figure, but it shows it broken down for 3 different dances.
Nice.
Every step in this book is done in multiple dances.
Mm.
So it doesn't teach you how to do a step. It teaches you how to do that same step in 3 dances simultaneously by adapting rhythm.
And if you're listening to this podcast, we will put some links to images in the show notes.
Yes, I would love to share it so you can see for yourself. It's a great book because it kind of, you see what they were actually doing here, and this would be what they were teaching the next generation of dancers and such. This would be what kids learned, and then they go out social dancing. Of course, that's what they're going to use. You know, they know 10 steps, but they know 10 steps they can use in every dance.
Yes.
It's a wonderful way to teach.
Yeah, you know, I'm sure you've been dancing for a while and teaching for a while. That's the interrelated system of teaching. That's not a new thing, but it's not really taught that way anymore, even though some of us have been dancing for a long time, know it because we were taught that. But you don't see it taught as much that way, in my opinion, anymore due to competition.
Right. And that's the difference sometimes on a private side of studios as opposed to franchises, that you take that beautiful knowledge of making people better dancers faster and more efficiently by doing just that, what's in the book. Let's take this idea and then let's make it work for 3 or 4 or 5 dances. And it really does, at the right time, make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, it allows somebody to not sit out a dance because they have to think of 3 different dances, right? Like, oh, this is a waltz. Oh, this is a foxtrot. Oh, this is a tango. Well, if I can do the exact same step in all of them, then I just learned 1 step, and I just do that step. I did this on my very first dance when I was maybe 11 years old, 10 or 11 years old. I had only had 1 or 2 lessons. So I only knew a few steps, and I remember it because it was surprising. I didn't understand. So I went there, and they were playing a song. It was a foxtrot, and I did the American Tango Basic, yes? And then the instructor ran up to me and said, "You can't do that. This is a foxtrot. That's a tango." And I said, I just did it. She said, you can't do that. And I said, I just did it. She said, no, this is a foxtrot. You can't do that. It's a tango step. I said, no, you can't do that because I just did it. And I was out of the mouth of babes, right?
Oh, man, that's amazing.
And it turns out that step is called the Americana. It was invented in 1934, and I've got an article on it. And it was made to be danced to waltz, tango, and foxtrot.
Oh, man.
I didn't even know I was right, but I was.
Love it.
Oh, that is so
That's a good story for us. That's very true.
I love that story.
So, yeah, that's the way people used to think as far as it's efficiency, you know?
Yes.
So I'm curious. The original waltz, which was very much like the Viennese waltz as we know it today, was at least of that tempo. How similar is the Viennese waltz of today to the early waltz out of Vienna?
Not that far off, really. I would say more international style, of course, because it's much simpler. American style is, well, complex. super cool. I love it. But yeah, that's definitely not for the average person to be able to add complexity in at those tempos.
They weren't doing explosions and such on the.
No,
in the VME.
some people. I don't want to say no one. That generally you're wrong when you say no one. But the average person, that would be beyond their capabilities. Somebody that was elite and had many years of dance training prior to that, which some people in the courts did. They had dance masters from the times they were born. Yeah, I'm sure they were amazing dancers, but that doesn't reflect the reality of most people.
Sure.
Mm.
Yeah. Yes. Make no mistake, there were people that danced at a pro level back then. But those were, again, people like in the court who didn't have jobs, who had dance teachers that taught them their entire lives.
So with many dances, you are seeing a great divide between social and competition. And I feel like there are loads of dancers on one side that never cross over to the other side and vice versa. Do you think there was always that divide between competition or social, or is that a new thing, newish?
Well, you said, new depends on how old we go, how far back we go. So the concept of really competitive dancing from the amateur side is relatively new.
Okay.
This started with the franchised studios, really, and in the 50s. It existed before then, but not much. It really didn't explode until then, in the 1950s. Then with that, you start to see the focus change when that went independent. That was the big crossover event, is the beginning of Pro-Am independent competitions, which were people, Bill Davies, Larry Silvers, my first teachers, and Frank Regan. They started American-style Pro-Ams in America. Yeah, or I should say, yeah, American Pro-Ams, because they wanted to pay for their trips to go compete. So they were like, hey, I got to go and travel and compete and cancel my lessons and spend this money to go there. Let me just do a few heats with my students, and that'll offset my costs.
Yeah.
So that was the beginning of that, really. Sorry,
and when was that again, Forrest?
I think they said it was 1964.
Okay.
If I remember correctly. So you can always ask Bill. But
so that before that, it was you only competed as a pro, like.
Yeah, like they said, there were competitions, but they were either big competitions, super small, like at a local dance hall competition, or huge, tiny, or closed to the studios, meaning the Fred Astaire competition, the Arthur Murray competition, essentially.
Okay.
So it would not, that limited the size, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And now the advent of like late 1940s, you have the beginning of the dance teacher organizations coming together to form one parent company that eventually became the NDCA.
Okay.
I think it's 1949 when they were first really starting that. But it took until I think 1958 until they created the first syllabus.
Okay.
And so then you can, well, I've got a copy of the 1958 syllabi, so you can see exactly what they taught.
You have that as well?
Yeah.
Of course he does.
Of course, I know. That was a bad question. Sorry.
You know what's fun about that is they actually taught samba in American style. They taught paso doble in American style. A lot of people don't realize.
Really?
American paso doble, it's real.
Oh my God, that's going to be a conversation for another time, because I'm seeing this now, because I was with Murray's for years, and they had Paso Doble. Now I'm independent, and I'm seeing American Paso Doble as an option, and I'm so confused by it. We don't have to diverge now, but at some point
later on, put a pin in it. But yeah, so just the dances that were done, there were other dances that were taught then that aren't really taught now in American style, which is an interesting thing. But yeah, if you look though, you're going to see that a little bit more practical than today, I think. Not as complex, right? So the waltz as we had to compete with one another, the idea of competition is complexity. It's about being elite, right? So the very nature of competition requires complexity. Whereas the nature of social dancing is the polar opposite.
Yeah.
It requires that I'm flexible and can dance with the most people, which is going to be, of course, the lowest bar. It starts there because most people are not good. And then as you get better, it's a pyramid, right? It's lonely at the top, right? So if you want to really be a good social dancer, you need to be here, not up here. If you're up here, no one can dance with you.
Yeah. I've looked at it a couple of different ways, and the way you broke that down just now just makes so much more sense.
Yeah, I know. I enjoyed that too. That was a perfect description with that pyramid, Forrest.
Yeah. So that's a big difference. I think that it's great for people like myself that have been dancing forever, and I'm sure you all enjoy constantly being able to learn because there's so much innovation out there. Mm-hmm. That's great. We can be lifelong learners, but that also is important as educators for us to understand that's for us and for our advanced students. And if we want to make dancing accessible to the masses, we need to check our ego and teach them what's applicable to them. Mm-hmm. Like one of my friends who was a pro fighter, he went to a guy that said, everyone's like, this is the best trainer. So he goes to him and he says, okay, you're the best trainer, you know, I want to know, what can you do for me, right? And the guy, you know, does all these impressive feats, and he goes, so when do you want to start? And he goes, I don't think I'm going to work with you. And he said, I don't think you heard me. I didn't ask what you could do. I asked what you could do for me. Mm. So often I think that too much of pros are peacocking instead of dumbing down to be at the level of their clients. You know, they're trying to bring their clients up to them because of competition.
You know what it is, and it has changed the process of, you know, what's available for people to teach or what is accepted or accredited or recognized and all of these things. And you're right, the complexity of the steps for competition are not very attainable for the masses, like you were discussing. And the point is, there is a really large quantity of students in that part of your studio or just in general that you want to make feel successful. So the steps need to be achievable, attainable, workable, flexible on the dance floor. And there's just such a wonderful conversation of the difference between the elite form of competitive dancing and social dancing.
So competition dancing is based upon stage dancing. I'm gonna grab a book.
Yeah,
another book.
I love it. This is amazing. This is amazing. Like it.
Yeah.
One of the things I would like to mention, so here's the book. This is The Art of Stage Dancing by Ned Wayburn. He was one of the most prolific choreographers on stage and screen in the beginning of you know, American cinema. He, you know, trained people for Siegfried's Follies, George White's productions. So major dance master, but he taught pros. He's a professional. So that's why the book's called Stage Dancing. They had two types of schools then. They had like normal schools, which taught dance teachers how to teach people, average person. And then they had people that specialized in stage dancing. And they coexisted, but they were kind of considered two different things, because one, you were teaching somebody to do exhibition dancing and to perform. And the other, you were teaching people how to dance with people at a dance hall. So that getting blended now in today's culture is where we have an issue, I guess, is making sure that our social and our exhibition, we understand the difference.
And they are completely different worlds, and that's part of the definition, is learning, you know, where do people sit and how you teach them and the content that you share with them to make them feel successful in either category is so relevant.
Yeah. So to get back to how that relates to Waltz, though, now you see Waltz and you see big top, you know, big top lines, right? I mean, that is hard to do.
Yeah.
You have to develop the ability to hold that frame, right? To have awareness of your joint articulations in your shoulder and clavicle, right? Very few people have it. It takes a long time. You see always the leader shoulder like that. Especially now you see the followers with, we call it broken necklines and such, because they're looking at the exhibition form where we're creating these types of lines, these oversways and shapes and things. That's completely unessential to dancing a waltz. It's nothing to do with it. There's no two ways to say that. It's, if I look at books after book, and I've got a whole stack of them sitting right here, you can see for yourself how people were actually holding each other.
Yep.
There we go.
That's a dance master. Now that's somebody who knows what they're doing.
Yep.
So you can see that's a very casual looking hold. Funny thing about this one, if you notice, it's waltz, but he would have what we consider a tango hold.
Yeah.
That was just considered a hold. You held your partner many different ways back then. There wasn't a way. There was options.
Yeah, that's interesting because I've noticed that when I first started teaching, right, like I would get all different kinds of people with, shoulder issues or whatever. And right away I was like, I'm not going to jam you into this big frame. We got to dance where you're natural. And then I got more into ballroom, and I'm just seeing these people just crank the arms up of all these students. And I'm like, what are you doing? What is happening? So that's, yeah.
You see in older stuff, if I hold stuff in the 1800s out, you're going to see a much lower frame often, like that, or even the left hand would be even lower.
Yeah. And I like that's nobody talks about that handhold anymore. About like that versus
handholds have changed over the years. They used to hold here like this, or they held over the top a lot as well. So it wasn't like this. This is more modern. But you did see it, after the ragtime era. But again, you see this much more common.
So cool.
Yeah, so many different layers. My goodness.
Yeah. So when sometimes I hear dance pros say things like, "Oh, it's the same. Waltz has never changed," and I'm like, "You don't read old books. It's not the same."
That's why you have to talk to Forrest. Absolutely.
Oh man, I was just looking at some stuff from the ragtime era, and it's funny. They're doing dips in the waltz, and they're doing kicks in the waltz, and you see that if you've seen anybody that's done a Viennese waltz, you'd see that they do like hesitations with kicks and hops and such. Yeah, you're familiar? So that was part of the waltz back then. That was the waltz. Whereas today we would think of that as being like, only Viennese, and well, that's all there was until the slow waltz was really invented.
Wow.
So yeah, so here you can see them. They're doing a little dip step here. This is from the dance by the Kenneys from 1914. Again, so look at that dip in the waltz. Woo!
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So again, you're going to just see things a little bit different. And if you looked at the holds and such, look at that reverse position.
Yep.
Yeah.
You don't see that anymore. If somebody did that, you'd be like, that's wrong. Well, those are pros.
Yeah, so it's really modern, and I say modern in the sense of we're looking at the entirety of the dance, right? So modern could be 100 years, right? But
yes.
so much further, right? So, but modern times are the ones who have really put it in a box, so to speak, like this is waltz or this is rumba, versus back then, like you said, you did one move through different dances. So you saw a lot of dips and you saw a lot of tricks in all of the dances versus, for instance, now, if you talk to somebody about like shag, right? Like, oh, that's a shag break. Well, that was just something they did in all the dances. You're calling it a shag break now. Does that make sense? Would that be safe to say that's
right? The idea of adaptation or appropriation, that's been going on forever. If you see something that's cool and you can do it and add it to your own vocabulary, why wouldn't you? Yeah, that's just common sense. I think too that you had from the beginning, if I go back, because I've got like the Dance Master convention notes going all the way back to the 1800s, and you can read what they discuss essentially in their meetings. And you're going to see that this conversation is as old as the hills, that the idea of two views happening. One is the idea of constant innovation, and the other is preservation of simplicity, if you will.
Okay.
So that's not a new argument. And you also, if I should mention this, whenever you look at historical documents, you'll see like some new waltz. It will be the glide step waltz, or they'll call it something, the champagne waltz. Let's make up a name for it. What that was really wasn't a unique dance form. What they were doing was teaching a new step to add to your waltz, a new maybe amalgamation for the dance teacher to teach. Okay. It wasn't like a new dance.
Right.
So a lot of times people will read stuff and they'll think, oh, the dance teachers were making up these new dances that no one did. No, it wasn't a new dance. It was just a few steps you threw into what you already did. Right.
So like going back to what you had mentioned before, like the Boston or something like that, would be more of a step within the waltz than an entire dance itself?
It was an entire dance, but it was also viewed as something, because it went to the same music. They also danced to Boston did 2/4 music as well as 3/4 music. And they started adapting waltz to 2/4 music as well, because that came into vogue, marches and things. So yeah, so you start seeing that happening during the late 1800s. And what you find though is this hard and fast rule is, I mean, you can say that, but do I care? If you tell me this, if I know already how to do these waltz steps and it's 3/4, and then you teach me some new steps, I'm just gonna mix them.
Yeah.
Why would I forget what I already do and I'm comfortable with? That doesn't make any sense. So anytime somebody tries to think that way, good luck with that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for giving us all this information about the waltz, and that went into so many different avenues, and that's how the waltz is going, and that's how dance is going. So we thank you so much for coming out and talking to us and sharing so much knowledge. I'm very excited to talk about many other things. There were so many ideas that we talked about today that I can't wait to pick your brain about. But once again, Forrest, and I know I'm saying it wrong, and I apologize.
No, don't apologize. That's how everybody says it.
Thank you so much for joining us, man. And this has been so cool.
One of the things that we should talk about in the future is maybe focusing a little bit more on the modern side, in like, say, country and western waltz and such, and the different subcultures of waltz in the modern era, because subcultures exist now.
Yes.
Oh, we'll take you up on that.
So we will definitely have a podcast with the developments of waltz. So stay tuned, everybody.
All right. My pleasure.
Thanks again.